Welcome to the ADISA and Real Assets Advisor webinar, 1031s, an update and outlook. First and foremost, our continued well wishes to each of you during this busy travel season, and we appreciate you joining today. I'm Brooke Heffington, Real Assets Advisor, Managing Director, co-sponsoring today's webinar with Executive Director of ADISA, John Harrison. Do you know the 3 states in the U.S. with 16 or more 1031 exchange properties? I'll give you a hint. John and I live in one of the 3, but more on that to come. Our agenda today consists of a sneak peek of the upcoming 1031 feature in the October issue of Real Assets Advisor. Brandon Balkman of Mountain Dale will provide a 1031 industry overview. Tom Rosenfield with HillStaffer will provide a legislative report on the situation facing 1031s and share predictions. John Harrison will review ADISA's history with 1031s and discuss the scope of 1031s to Congress and more. You're encouraged to submit questions via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen during the webinar. We will allow 10 minutes following the webinar to address Q&A. All questions submitted will be answered in a timely manner and at a later date. Thank you again for joining today, and I invite you to please provide your feedback following the webinar in a survey that will be emailed to all registrants. Erin, could you please cue the poll? So if you would, please take a moment to review the 2 questions and answer. Our first poll question: what is the appropriate number of available 1031 exchange offerings? You have 3 options: 40 to 50 offerings, 51 to 60, 61 to 70. Please select your answer. Question number 2: what is your estimate for the amount of capital raised for 2021? Or how much do you expect securitized 1031's offerings will raise in 2021? 3 billion or less, around 4 billion, 5 billion or more? Please make your selections. And you can see the results. Those are interesting, and Brandon Balkman will certainly be speaking to those results during his presentation. Brandon, take note. There they are.
Will do.
Fantastic. Certainly, again, we want to thank you today for participating as ADISA members eagerly await the annual conference and trade show, October 4th through 6th in Las Vegas. Real Assets Advisor subscribers can anticipate a feature article on DST 1031 product sponsors at a glance in the upcoming October issue. And I'm going to provide just a brief sneak peek of that by sharing my screen. And there's more on this to come with Real Assets Advisor in the October issue. There's your sneak peek. And at this time, I would like to introduce Brandon. Brandon, as the Senior Vice President for Marketing at Orchard Securities, Brandon Balkman performs the role of a securities and marketing consultant for various real estate firms, sponsors, with investment funds and 1031 exchange offerings. Brandon is also the Managing Director of Mountain Dale Consulting, which has tracked the securitized 1031 market since 2003. He is serving as a board member and president of the Foundation for the Alternative and Direct Investment Securities Association, ADISA. Brandon, I'll turn it over to you at this time.
Great, thank you. So the report we have here is normally created each quarter. So the last one we did was June 30th for the 2nd quarter, but this is a special report that we created just for this event. The stats are gathered on the 15th and the last day of every month. Mountain Dale is an affiliate of Orchard Securities, which is a broker-dealer. And we create, well, the stats that come from this are generously provided by various sponsors in the field. And so first of all, we're grateful that they provide us this data. So stats have been gathered since 2002, as you see there on the far left. We only gather information on new offerings. We do not follow them once they have closed. We get that question a lot, and we can't do that. We have a hard enough time getting all the information as it is by the date that we need it. You can see there in 2006, it was the largest year to date. 3.65 billion. 2019 came very close to 2006 in the number, and then it did it again on August 15th, as you see there on the far right. But today, as of this week, we have surpassed 2006. So we are in uncharted waters right now. This is the same type of graph, but a little more information. Now, note that the number of active programs today is 164 versus 341 back at the last high in 2006. Also note, in 2006, we had 71 active sponsors, and then today we have 37. So everything is, at least half of what it was before. That's because deals are bigger, and we have less sponsors that survived that time, and realize it costs money and energy to stay in this whole market. This slide shows you all the sales that are tracked. Now, just because someone's at the top doesn't mean they're a better sponsor. It just means that they have more product and product that people want to purchase. And they're in an asset class that is in demand. So there's a couple of firms there that they concentrate on a specific asset class. Either it's not selling well, or they can't get enough of the product. Otherwise, if they did, they would probably have higher numbers. Some of these names are very familiar with folks. Some of these are exclusive to broker dealers. So if you want to do business with them, you might not be able to. Some of these, especially, for example, on the bottom there, the senior living fund, you'll notice they've had 0 sales, but they do a product. Their focus is really to get people to buy their fund. And when they go to a firm to present that, they go to firms that say, I don't want to add another product sponsor on our list unless you have a diverse amount of different products. And so that's a sales tactic for them to say, well, we have a 1031. So they really don't care if they sell much of it because it satisfies their needs. So everyone on this list has their own plan, their purpose. They may not ever want to get bigger than this. They're happy where they are. They don't want to grow their selling group. Some do. So it really, you have to be careful with this list, is what I'm trying to say. So what's selling? Well, obviously multifamily is hot, as you see there. So this is the same thing broken out. And if you combine the 3 multifamily asset classes, you have multifamily manufactured housing, and the student housing. And then if you added senior housing, because in a way that's also a form of multifamily, that total is 58% of the market. That's quite significant. Where are these properties that are selling? So if a deal had multiple states in it, say it had 10, we list all 10 of those on here. So the numbers, if you totaled them all up, would far exceed the number of offerings that have been available year to date. And one of the questions that was asked earlier was, which state do two of our hosts reside in, and that would be Georgia. So one thing in common I see here, the tax-free states of Texas and Florida have the highest amount. And that's evident there. Then you have other states that have really good economies and job growth. Now, some would question Illinois, but there are a number of corporations that have their headquarters there. So there's a lot of job growth, regardless of the fact of their politics. So politics do play a factor in here in most cases. If it's hard to do business, if the unions are strong, it's just, you will find there's less deals in those states. Now, there's some oddballs here. Utah, where I am right now, has 0. That's sad because it's a great state. You have Washington State. There's another tax-free state. There's only 2. Nevada, only 6. So, I don't know sometimes why people pick where they go, but this gives you an example. Now, diversification is always encouraged by financial advisors, and that can be done by asset class, product sponsor, and in this case, geography. What's available? So it's interesting, there's a little less multifamily product available than the current sales demand. Retail is half as much available as sales demand. So there's an opportunity there. Student housing and office are oversupplied. Maybe there's a message there. This is a snapshot as of August 15th. You'll see that we have a total of available equity of a little over $1 billion there. I'm sorry, yeah, it's $1 billion. And that hasn't happened very often. That's an awful lot of equity there. That's equivalent to 9.4 weeks of product available. 45 days ago, we only had 5.7 weeks of product. So what's happened? Well, sponsors have come up, met the challenge. They've provided more product, especially in the multifamily area, to meet the need. But you're going to find, unfortunately, one of the things that we're finding is the first year yield continues to decline because they're dealing with new lending policies and practices, and those they're just not providing the kind of equity at a reasonable rate that we're used to before. So I guess it's the new normal, right? That we have to deal with. Now, another thing that's interesting is the days on market. It says average days on market. Multifamily is very low at 64. That used to be a lot higher. Product is moving very fast, and it's very difficult for some advisors to get equity in the deals that they want. There are a number of deals that are out there. I guess some people might call them stale because they've been out there for more than a year. But sometimes their old returns look pretty promising. So you do have to look at all the deals. Anyway, this is an interesting chart. It has a lot of information. It also compares the equity raise between 2019, 20 to 21. And it gives you an idea of what was hot then, what isn't now. You'll notice that energy has dropped. Hospitality was pretty good at 2%. Now it's 0. So multifamily is pretty much the same. So here's a summary of the whole market and just a few words here. Some of the things I'd like to point out is it says here number of active sponsors. We have 37 active, but only 27 actually have a deal out today. It's very competitive for sponsors to come up with product. They're competing with one another as well as competing with others out there in the market, and it's tight. It's very hard to come up with product. Also, you'll notice I added 200 million there on the right. We do have a couple of companies that don't always provide the data, or in some cases they do ticks and they're just big deals and they give us the information in blocks. You'll notice there the offerings 506B and 506C, those are just different types of ways to register it. 506C allows for general solicitation. The item I like there on the bottom, days on market, we talked about that before, but this really shows you the median was 78, or it is as of the 15th. But in just at the end of the year, 2020, it was 164. That right there tells you the market is totally different right now. It's a crazy market. Where are we headed? We're headed at 5.5. So hopefully, I saw that about a third of the people picked this one, but that's where we're going. And this is new territory. We're headed off the chart. And it just shows you on this compared where we were with other years not too far past. Where are we going? This kind of gives you a summary there. We talked about what the total is. You've got the average equity raise per week at 107 million. That was at 76.2 just 8 months ago. Market demand is very strong. Supply has caught up, but it's at a cost. The projected returns are lower. We're hoping that President Biden's American Family Plan, which we're going to hear more about, will keep this going and continue going off the chart. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Brandon. Excellent report, and we look forward to getting into those uncharted waters. I think that that sounds exciting to us. Before we start our sort of political part of this, we'd like to just get a read on where you sit in terms of knowledge of how 1031s are currently doing in Congress, sort of your knowledge of the process. So Aaron, could you throw up the poll here, and we'll get a quick read on that from folks. I'd like for you all, if you will, to rate your level of understanding of the current, that is up to the minute today, situation in Congress regarding 1031s. Rate it from 1 to 5. 1 if you do not have a clue what's going on, and 5 if you're very well informed and feel like you understand the process. So if you'll take just a second to do that. And while you're doing that, I want to thank Brandon for crunching the numbers for us just for this event. I know it is difficult to get all the data together, and I want to thank all his sponsors who were involved with 1031 for getting the data to the Mountain Dell folks. And you'll of course see these data updated again in a couple months here, or at the ADISA event coming up. So Aaron, let us know. Also, we've got a bell. We've got a normal distribution pretty much here. So a little, I like that. So we feel like we have a good audience, and we will press ahead. I will give you a little bit of background on our messaging to Congress and what we actually do. And then Tom Rosenfield, who is our man in DC, will then completely confuse you with how the process is at least supposed to work. So I've been involved with the arguing on the Hill in these for 1031 since about 2012, back in the Dave Camp days. And in that time, it was completely a bipartisan thing, because it was strictly viewed as a tax treatment. And Dave Camp, being a Republican, he was chair of Ways and Means at that time, just locked himself in a room and decided, here we got to cut this, that, and the other. We got to raise money here. We got to spend money there. And in so doing, with the Republicans were taking a little bit of shots at trying to revamp and redo 1031s, and then that's moved back and forth. And so it is in many ways a bipartisan issue, in that everyone is interested in it who delves into taxation. I think our message before Congress is fairly simple, and this is using Biden's the Biden administration's own numbers. They project that if 1031s were to disappear or be significantly curtailed, the U.S. Treasury would gain about $2 billion a year. They have to project this over 10 years. And I don't know, Tom, if you're going to touch on the Robert Byrd rule or not, but you have to have a 10-year projection on a lot of these tax issues. So that you're looking at the 10 years, it's 19 billion that would be gained if 1031s went away. So that's about 1.9 billion per year. Well, that's on the US government would gain side. Now, if you look at the other side, which is what would be lost, what does that cost if 1031s are significantly curtailed? What that cost, and these are studies that we were involved in, what that cost is about 55 billion a year in GDP, and about 500,000 jobs that are associated with that. In other words, almost 15%, or approximately somewhere between 10 and 20% of all commercial real estate in this country is involved with 1031s. This is a big deal. So what you find here, and these data come from a couple of reports that ADISA was involved with back in 2014, 2015. I happened to have the good fortune to review the 2014 report in terms of the math and the approach. These were done by academics as well as Ernst & Young. And we have these data and they are very sound. So you can see that the question of 1031s is not that they are valuable for the country, is clear. Now, so our message to Congress is, look, 100 years ago in 1921, this was introduced as part of the original tax code. This was a brilliant policy. You should be taking a victory lap, not looking to tinker with it. And so the only argument back we've gotten is, well, there's no argument on the math. The math is clear. What we're worried about is the optics, rich people doing this and middle class not getting this, and say, well, relax on the optics, because here is an issue that is frankly bipartisan. The blue states, California, New York, have the most 1031s. California has almost half of the 1031 activity in our space, at least. And overall, it's a huge, and you realize that the securitized space is only a fraction of what's going on. But overall, in terms of all of them, California is by far the largest share of 1031 activity. So that's one mark for bipartisanship. Another is it's an environmental issue. A lot of conservation properties are involved in 1031. And then it's an agricultural issue. You've got a lot of agriculture involved in 1031. And also, if it's particularly at the securitized level, you're looking at people who are little guys that are investing in this. This isn't necessarily just huge institutional investments we're talking about. You've got people, the elderly, who are in here. And so the reaction back, once they understand that, is that, okay, what about this limit deal, the $500,000, $1 million limit idea? And my response to that is, well, how slow do you want to fly the plane to see how slow it can go before it falls out of the sky? This is a dangerous exercise in reality. You might be able to do something mathematically, but we haven't seen any good data that would lead us to anything like that. So the question is also, how would you deal with it geographically? Because if you're talking about that kind of limitation, properties in California have nothing to do with property in Oklahoma. So it doesn't make any sense to take that approach. And by and large, we get folks on board. We have to do this argument perennially, because every time there's a new Congress, or even turnovers in the legislative staff, we have to re-educate them on the value of this. It's not something that's on the top of everybody's list. But once they see the numbers, once they see the math, we tend to be treated very well. Now, most recently during the Trump years, real estate obviously being part of Trump's portfolio during that administration, we probably had some undue scrutiny simply because of the political effect going on. But the question still exists that other industries were also involved. So real estate, it was narrowed down to real estate because of the nature of real assets. So that's the only change we've seen in recent years. I know that some of you may have questions about all of this, and as Brooke said, please write those in, and we will try to answer them at the end of the session today. So if you have questions on our approach, please do so. I do want to give a shout out to Larry Sullivan and others who are heavily involved in our 1031 efforts on the Hill. Many of you watching particularly have been meeting with us in Congress. And I've got to say right now, formerly Tom and I and several others would go to all these offices on the Hill. It's been done by Zoom mostly these past few months, which has been interesting. It has some efficiencies, but you do miss out on at least sort of feeling who can be your friend going forward as we push more and more within Congress as this goes on. So I'm going to wrap up my phase and bring on our man in Washington, Tom Rosenfield. Tom has been a bond broker as well as an attorney in DC. So he is well positioned to understand the investment space as well as ADISA's subset of that particularly. So we're absolutely honored and privileged to have Tom, and you will be able to also hear Tom at the October conference when we look for further updates on that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Tom, and confuse us all with this process.
I'll try not to, John, but thank you very much. Thank you to the other panelists as well. And I just want to first say, I wouldn't be here without my team. We have an awfully large team that are experts in a variety of areas of budget and lobbying and whatnot. So people behind the scenes that are working on ADISA members' behalf on our team include Joel Cassidy, former chief of staff, multiple chief of staff, Joanne Faulkner, Ann Darconte, and Owen Kane. So we have quite a few bodies who are working from that standpoint. But I want to just follow up on John's comments and then talk a little bit about the process and what it all means to ADISA. As John suggested, it's a very political process. 1031s are a 100-year-old tax policy. They're often viewed as a perk, though they are not indeed a perk. But that is the image, and because of ADISA's and other organizations' efforts over the years, that is changing. And one of the things everyone should remember is there are many members of Congress who actually utilize 1031. So there's understanding, but that doesn't prevent old attitudes from dying quickly enough. And 1031s, as is happening again this year, often become a pay for, an opportunity for legislators to try and figure out how they're going to pay for everything. So that's why we're involved. That's why ADISA remains involved. And before I talk about some of the politics, I want to go back to square one a little bit and talk about the budget process, because there are a lot of ambiguities, technicalities. It's a relatively complex and arcane process that is not, for the most part, followed on Capitol Hill, or rarely has been followed and hasn't been for years. But everyone should remember that spending has to be authorized and appropriated. So we talk about a budget, and you see in the press, there's a budget, it gets passed, it doesn't get passed. It's actually far more complicated than that. As they get authorized and appropriated, remember, authorization is simply Congress saying that money can be spent on a given item, not that it necessarily will be spent. So when Congress passes a budget, it's authorizing an amount of government spending, but that's just what is allowed to be spent. In order to actually spend the money, there has to be an appropriations bill, and appropriations are done by Congress via legislation. It authorizes agencies to actually make payments, i.e. to spend the money. They're normally passed each year, but on a growing basis every year, they're not done on time, and that's where the use of continuing resolutions are often utilized. But I just want everybody to keep those two ideas in mind. Secondly, is that appropriations are handled separately from entitlements and taxes. And remember, entitlements and taxes, or the entitlement side of the spending, makes up over 50% of all the expenditures by government. But appropriations are handled separately from that process. Third is, you often hear that the fiscal year ends on September 30th, and that is a true statement. But again, remember that applies only to appropriations. It does not apply to entitlements or taxes, which are passed on and amended throughout the year. But there is a normal budget process, believe it or not, and it doesn't really reflect the way each of you run your business or the way your CFO or CEO expects a budget to be put together. And you typically look at revenues and expenses. I'm reminded that the Budget Act of 1974, which created a process, the gentleman who created it apparently was fond of saying Democrats like to spend money, Republicans like to spend money as well. They just feel guilty about it. And the point of that is there's a lot of focus by the legislators on spending money, not so much dealing with the revenue side. So in a perfect world, or in the ideal world, the government would follow its rules established in 1974, which would have the president proposing a budget by the first Monday in February. And then by April 15th, Congress would pass a non-binding budget resolution. And then appropriations committees would get what's called a budget allocation from or based on that resolution. And then they'd put together a series of appropriation bills for each of the departments that make up our federal government, where to spend the money, not how to pay for it, simply where to spend it, the nuts and bolts of operating the government. And you're probably already thinking about what happens if there are deficits, right? That's a separate process. And that's up to Treasury to handle borrowing to manage deficits, and or Congress, who will raise the debt ceiling as they have every year and need to do, or taxes, but that's handled in a separate process. So it may be all generically thought of as part of the budget process, but it's a different process. All of this is then done, or what was set up in 1974, by September 30th, when the fiscal year currently ends. But again, as a reminder, that's only applying to appropriation, not entitlements and taxes. Senate Finance and House Ways and Means committees are the committees that have charge over entitlements and taxes, the revenue programs, if you will. And they set about doing it on their timetable. But as I've already stated, the process rarely, if ever, operates in this manner. The deadlines typically come and go. And as we all know, the parties have had an increasing difficulty compromising and working together. So it's tougher to pass whatever budget resolutions may come out. And as they've not met deadlines on appropriations, they've utilized continuing resolutions, which give them some extra time. And again, in the ideal world, both parties would agree on where they want to spend money, and they would come up with the budgets, and they'd come up with the programs, and would be done. In years where there is no agreement, the reconciliation process has been utilized as a way of passing a budget allocation. I'm sorry, a budget resolution. And 2021 is no different from that standpoint. Perhaps I'm not a historian on these matters, but I think one of the areas where 2021 has started to be a little bit different is that House and Senate members recognized really from the get-go, as soon as the new administration came in and the new members of Congress were sworn in, that there wasn't going to be agreement on a budget resolution. As we all know, Democrats took control of both the House and Senate. And with that, their public policy agenda, which was to spend a lot of money and create a lot of new social programs and increases in taxes, and recognizing that it would not pass under normal budget rules, if you will, which require 60 votes in the Senate. Pretty much the House and Senate went straight to reconciliation. But that too, they recognized that they're going to have to change laws to get reconciliation passed. They would never get the 60 votes, as I mentioned. So they went on to reconciliation. And that's this $3.5 trillion that you've seen in the papers for a couple of months since the Senate passed their version in July. Recognize that that's part of really an overall budget resolution. There are some appropriations bills on top of that. Again, they run on a separate track procedurally, but they are part of that. The press and the articles make it seem this is all that is going on in Washington, and it's not. It's simply that's the primary focus, because that's where all of the new programs are, and that's where obviously $3.5 trillion, where the outsized portion of all this, the spending is going to take place. So the Senate, having passed a budget resolution that allowed them to spend and tax this $3.5 trillion that the chair, Bernie Sanders, created. So what the Democrats passed, or what the Senate passed, excuse me, in July, was authorizing the reconciliation bill. And that's what the House passed this week. They deemed it, it's another way of effectively passing it without having to directly vote on it. But now we have to get to the specifics. And so as the process starts to develop between now and the end of September, there are different committees that will go to work trying to figure out exactly how they will spend this $3.5 trillion, who they will tax, how they will pay for it, the specifics of what really happens. And you may recall when the Senate passed their version, they already got their 12 committees started, and they have a deadline of September 15th to report back to the Senate Budget Committee. So that's really just the process from here on out now, and they're similar in the House and the Senate. Again, the 12 Senate committees will work on their $3.5 trillion. That's what you'll see in the press, how to pay for it. Ultimately, it goes back to the Budget Committee, and then it will go to the floor. And that's where the parliamentarian will rule. And I'll talk about this in a minute, but that's a little bit of a different process, or a meaningful process, than in the House. But essentially, both processes now will be the same. They will figure out how they're going to spend the money, how they're going to pay for it. And in theory, they will report back to their respective budget committees by September 15th. The House process will be much simpler from our perspective, and from the lay leader perspective, or I should say from the public perspective, than the Senate, because it's simple majority rule in the House, and House leadership has a much stronger grip on control over process procedures and rules than in the Senate. There is a parliamentarian process, but that really isn't likely going to play a role in on the House side of things. There will be opportunity for debates and amendments, but amendments will be severely limited. Probably 0 or 1 is kind of the guess. I mean, and we'll get to prognostications, but the process should flow, relatively speaking, compared to the Senate, seemingly effortlessly, though behind the scenes there'll be a lot of jockeying. On the Senate side, once these 12 committees come back to the Budget Committee and it goes to the floor, the parliamentarian will rule. And as we know from earlier this year, when the Democrats tried to raise minimum wage, in the Senate, you have the Byrd rule, and I'm not going to get into the specifics of that. That gets to be very arcane. But basically, anything that gets passed through reconciliation must meet a series of rules. They're relatively strict, though it's up to the parliamentarian in the end to say, yes, this passes muster, or no, it does not. And I would imagine that how much of the $3.5 trillion that's in the resolution now that stays in will be based in large part on what they think they can get through the parliamentarian, and of course what the House will agree to, but the House will likely agree to the larger number of the two. So it's really probably going to be focused on the parliamentarian. Once she rules, then as in the House, the Senate will go to debates, amendments. There'll be more amendments, though not unlimited. And then ultimately, in both chambers, you'll have passage. or there'll be a vote, presuming there is agreement between the House and Senate. And once you have final passage, any differences will have to be ironed out. And then ultimately, in theory, there will be something that comes out and goes to the president's desk for signature. Will it happen by September 15th? I think in terms of reporting back to the committees, 50-50. There's a lot going on between now and then, and the $3.5 trillion is pretty complicated because some of the money requires the creation of new rules and procedures. Some of it is just added to existing agencies' rules, procedures, and infrastructure. So yeah, who knows if they'll meet it, but that's a rolling deadline. Will they meet it by the time the fiscal year ends on September 30th? Again, who knows? Doesn't really matter at the end of the day. It really is just a matter of what will they get passed and what can they get agreement on. So how does this impact ADISA? Well, as far as 1031s are concerned, ADISA has been successful along with other groups going out, getting champions of 1031s. There's been a lot of pushback from members of Congress. These are remains after 100 years, a very important public policy to promote investment and reinvestment in local communities around the country, as John talked about. That's not lost on members, as is the billions of dollars in transfer taxes that are created and coming out of post-COVID when you're trying to figure out how to pay for a lot of big programs and the states need money. Taking away a big portion of their revenue streams may not be a good idea. But that said, there still is potential. And at what point in the process between now and when something is passed of this $3.5 trillion is anybody's guess. It can come up at any point in the process between now and then. It could be as late as conference and be secret and behind closed doors. It certainly, any amendments that come out, unlike we saw in the Senate, will be binding. So there's much more at stake from here on out in the process. And while ADISA is obviously very, very appreciative, as is the entire industry, of Senator Kennedy's amendment, it's not binding. And so now as we move forward, so what that means to ADISA is really twofold. One, and this is to everyone who's watching you as ADISA members, we have to remain vigilant and be defensive. We have to pay attention to the process, behind the scenes, what's being discussed by the various committees, to ensure that 1031s don't all of a sudden pop up and be used in any way, shape, or form. Secondly, though, is offensive, as ADISA has been and will continue to do, is to be identifying champions who now will play a greater role in the process from here, let's just say to the end of September, though it will go to October at some point, but from here to the end, and identify those champions and continue to work closely with them. So we'll narrow our focus on members of Congress who will be playing a greater and greater role in the process as we move forward, working with them to ensure that they continue to remember how important 1031s are to the economic engine of America, that they are to the revenue streams of states and localities. And beyond that, that's really everything that can be done. In terms of prognostications, which I know John wanted me to touch on briefly, timing, likely that reconciliation gets passed. And when I say likely on anything, I'm talking better than 50-50. Reading tea leaves beyond that gets difficult, but the reconciliation will get passed. It won't be the 3.5 trillion. If you pulled our team, it would be in the $2 to $2.5 trillion range, but to be determined. And again, the key for ADISA is, but are 1031s being used as pay-fors in some fashion? Likely the infrastructure bill will get passed. I haven't talked about that. That's on the side. That includes some appropriation portions of bills, but that likely will get passed as well. And our guesstimate is early October somewhere. Again, the timing is less meaningful. And I think that summarizes, I think, the process to date and where we're going. John?
Thanks so much, Tom. I think that's helpful. It does show, well, one, I think it shows a lot of power right now will reside with the parliamentarian of the Senate. And she was, who appointed her? I can't remember. Do you remember? I think she was a Republican appointee, right?
Yeah, I do not remember.
Yeah. But it would take a supermajority to overrule her, I believe. I think you would need so she's pretty much she and Joe Mnuchin are huge right now. I mean, Joe
Manchin. Manchin, and don't forget Senator Sinema, and potentially Senator Warner out of Virginia. And there are probably some members behind the scenes who quietly are not really in favor, which is why it will become a negotiation and something will pass, and it's probably not 1 trillion. And it's most likely not 3.5, but where is it? Where's the middle ground for compromise amongst the Democratic Party?
Right. So really, in terms of the team tactics, the Republicans and the Democrats on this thing, do you think everybody's pretty much following the norm? Is anybody, do you see any surprises that you think has anything the Republicans done or the Democratic groups have done? Would you have predicted what they're doing now? Are they pretty much following the way one would expect them to go?
I think it's predictable based on how events evolve, right? And when the Democrats lost with the parliamentarian earlier, I think it probably shook them up a little bit that they need to be careful. But I mean, listen, they came in controlling both chambers with a clear public policy agenda of creating enormous new spending and enormous new tax increases. They're going to do everything in their power to pass those policies while they're in power, because all bets are off a year from now when we get to midterms. So I don't think anything would surprise me from that standpoint. And there is, at the end of the day, very little the Republicans can do, right? Government was set up to work together to give the power to the majority, but some power to the minority to have a say. It was meant for both parties to work together in the end for compromise. And in many ways, that ship has sailed. So nothing will surprise me at this point.
Great. Well, thanks, Tom, so much for that. And I see we are right on schedule. So I'll turn it back over to Brooke. I believe you have some questions you want particulars to fields, questions for Brandon or Tom or me.
Yes, and thank you for being so prompt to all of our participants today. That's excellent. First, I have 2 questions for you, Brandon. The first question is from Peter Roberts. And the question is, are Mountaindale's total available offerings the total that was available at some point in the year?
Yeah, and we can look back at past records and more than happy to share that information.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Peter, for your question. That answers yes. And we have a second from an anonymous attendee. The second question for you, Brandon, is where is there opportunity and where is there oversupply, referencing the first presentation, yours, of course. And I do definitely recall you mentioning there was opportunity in retail, but I'm going to let you elaborate on the response.
So I think there's opportunity in every single asset class because there's the big boys out there and their returns are low. So if you can come out with a product that has a higher return and you're willing to do the kind of reporting that people expect, That's one of the problems. You come out, you're a new sponsor, you have no track record, and you don't have any kind of reporting to show. We'll create some. I mean, you gotta wow us, or we're not gonna look at it. People need to get excited to want to make a change. You would with any product, make it to where you can't. I mean, you got to have a head turner in order to pay attention to that. So there is lots of opportunities. So why would somebody buy a product at the same return from you, a new supplier, versus someone that's been in the business for 10, 15, 20 years? There's no reason at all. You have to do something different and to stand out. Otherwise, it's easy to go the traditional route. So yeah, there's lots of opportunities.
Well, you heard it here first to all of our participants right there from Brandon Balkman. We did have a question for Tom in the Q&A section, which I do see that Tom did answer. Tom, would you like to just read that question and just read your response, just to ensure all the participants are hearing the question and your response?
Sure. So what was asked was if there's an update on Steppedup Basis. What are we hearing? And as of a couple of days ago, what we're hearing is it's definitely still on the block. It ranks behind capital gains, which clearly will be going up in some fashion, but ahead of carried interest. All three still remain on the block, and there's suggestions of a $500,000 cap, but nothing until the sale, and a spousal exemption of some sort, so that you could, with that kind of a proposal, you could protect all the constituents in some fashion, right? No one's thrown out of their house because they can't pay taxes. No one's forced to do a sale. You really just impact the heirs, but again, not the surviving spouse, and you capture some tax revenues. That's the latest what we've heard, but it's a very fluid time, and how much remains in is to be determined.
Thank you. We do have another question from Michael Zelkin. Isn't there a chance both parties will sacrifice 1031s as a cheap way to go after wealthy interests and get significant PR while minimizing actual taxes received?
So the answer to that is absolutely. That always stands as a possibility. That's why we have to be defensive, both defensive and offensive, right? Do I think it's as likely? I'm not going to say it's not as likely, or I'm going to be careful about saying that, because I don't want to suggest that there's nothing to worry about. But given the public's general knowledge about 1031s being very limited, and given that in the press generally over the years, things like carried interest tend to be much higher on the minds of the articles of perks for the rich and wealthy. My guess is that probably comes in a little bit under carried interest, but absolutely, carried interest has a big lobby. All right, all of the private equity guys, the big lobby. We're hearing it's done, even though it also raises minimal in taxes, and so I would say absolutely must be aware of it. Not sure how likely, but can't take those chances.
Tom, if I might add, I think because of the strength of 1031s in California, particularly, it would be tough. I think, as Tom says, it is possible, but I think it's highly unlikely at this point. There's not that, if we were talking about a big benefit, a big payoff for doing this, for eliminating 1031s, you might have but the numbers, Biden's own numbers, show basically a rounding error, if you that would be in the Treasury's favor. So I don't see unless the rank and file want to stick it to the coasts, which I don't see happening, particularly with Pelosi as leader in the House and Schumer in the Senate. I just don't. I don't see it at this point, Tom. you might, I mean, I agree with you. It is, Tom's more cautious, I think, than I am, because he's probably seen how sausage is made a little bit more. But I think they will, 1031s will survive as is. That's my prediction.
Thank you. Well, we have 4 minutes left. We did have 2 questions that did ask where the slides and the webinar may reside. So please let me share with all of our attendees that you can visit adisa.org and realassets.advisor.com. The live webinar recording will be available there, and it will include the slides. If there's anything else I need to add to that, someone can send me a quick message. But they will live there on our sites, this video recording. And we do appreciate all the questions today and your interaction in the poll. And certainly, I know John will want to, but I certainly want to thank ADISA for their partnership with Real Assets Advisor over the years. And I'm very privileged to work with Jill at Spotlight Marketing and the ADISA team. And special thanks to Brandon and Tom for your participation today. And I know John will want to certainly conclude from here.
Thank you, Brooke, so much for all your work in putting this together, and the whole team. And we look forward to seeing most of you in a month and a half or so in Vegas. And stay tuned to both websites, Real Assets website as well as ADISA's website, for updates. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.